217.8 normally aspirated and supercharged engines, as well as a little bit about a Continental 226 engine. What you find on the internet, and you'll find in a lot of articles that are consistently wrong because people think they know what they're talking about without actually looking up the information, is that the Graham 217.8 engine is actually a Continental engine. This couldn't be further from the truth. You see, what many people do not understand is that Graham Page Motors never had a foundry. This did not mean that they did not do their own engineering. This did not mean in most cases that they didn't make their own engines. It did mean that they in fact contracted with Continental to cast and make parts for the engine. But the engine was entirely, the 217.8, was entirely designed in Graham Page's own engineering department to their own specifications. Now, it is also true that Continental made a version of the 217.8, which later became known as the 226. That particular engine, larger displacement, was originally developed for industrial applications. It is a cheapened version of the Graham engine. It shares many characteristics with it, but it is not, in fact, originally a Continental designed engine. It is based off of Graham's engineering, and they went on and made their version of the engine as the 226. The 226 and the 217.8, the Graham engine, do share a number of components, or a number of things will interchange, but there are also parts that are totally unique to the Graham engines that cannot be used on the Continental based engines. So lest somebody say, oh, you don't know what you're talking about, you're just making it up, I've read that on the internet, I know that it's really a Continental engine. No, it's not. This is the book where you're going to find the information. Graham Page Legacy from 1932 on. There are actually 2 volumes to this. The first covers prior to 1932. The second one covers from 1932 on. These are very serious books that Michael Keller did, and they're completely researched. Now I've got a page here I'm going to open to that I bookmarked, and right here you'll see listings of the models of the Graham cars in the 30s and which engines they actually used. Over here, I'm going to look for a moment and I'll find where and point it out to you. In 1936 is the first time you'll see the 217.8. Right here is the 217.8. It's as a Cavalier, was used in that model and was in the Supercharger that year. That is Graham's engine, and as you notice, when you read across here, they are listed as their own engines. Now, from 1936 all the way through 41, the 217.8, it's always their own engine. And you can find over here on the side a note about the Continental engine saying that it's quite different. And it's right here. Everything in the book is footnoted. So the author tells you more information, and he'll even tell you where the information came from. This is where you're going to find the authoritative information that shows that the 217.8 never was a Continental engine. It was a Graham engine that Continental was casting parts for Graham, because Graham did not have a foundry. So they hired them to do the castings. Having said that, for the initial background, we're going to talk a little bit about the engines. Right here we happen to have a 217.8 from 1939. This is a normally aspirated engine, obviously totally rusty, but this engine is completely rebuildable and will be rebuilt to go in the 2-door sedan back here in the back of this garage. Things to note about the 217.8 normally aspirated engine. The carburetor, intake, exhaust manifold is all on the passenger side. The intake and exhaust manifolds are entirely unique to the normally aspirated. They do not interchange with the supercharged car. The distributor is different from the supercharged distributor. The piping locations, the generator, they're all different from the supercharged engine. If we look down here on the side of the engine, we'll let our camera catch up. The fuel pump is located in the same location, but it has a different heat shield than you would find on a supercharged engine. You have a different drain off of the intake manifold, not found on the supercharged engine. All of your cabling and rods is different than on a supercharged engine. Another thing to note, comparing this to the supercharged engine we'll look at in a minute, the crankshafts are completely different. They are not interchangeable. You cannot take a crankshaft from a normally aspirated 217.8 and put it into a supercharged 217.8. They are not interchangeable. When we look on the passenger side, we'll note that the oil filler, completely different on the normally aspirated engine. We'll note that the location of the oil center is completely different on the normally aspirated engine. The pulley system up front is also different on the normally aspirated engine. And if you look right on the side here, you'll see that the bosses for mounting a supercharger are cast into the block. However, those bosses are not drilled, and the internal passages for the oiling of the supercharger do not exist. Converting a non-supercharged block to a supercharged block is extremely difficult. Basically, go find yourself a supercharged engine to use. Other things to note here about the two engines. When you get to 1938, 39, 40, and 41 217.8s, they have more studs on the top than they did in 36 and 37. It was found that the 36, 37 engines, which I have, I believe it's 13 less studs, they would blow head gaskets when they were supercharged. So they added additional studs to the top of the engines. There are more studs in the tops of these engines than any other six-cylinder ever produced. Obviously, the Continental, being based on the engine, uses a huge number of studs also. So now we're going to walk over and we're going to look at the supercharged engine a little bit. Here we have a supercharged engine, and a lot of the accessories are not located on it. This engine will eventually be going in a Hollywood. It was in a Hollywood. The yellow color here on the oil filler is somebody's idea that, well, they're yellow now, they should be yellow. Well, that's not correct, but that's what color they painted it. You do see we have the supercharger location here, complete with studs, and it's actually drilled in here for oil passages like it's supposed to be. So there's actually an oil passage behind here. That means the interior of the block is drilled for mounting the supercharger on it and supplying oil to it. Again, as I mentioned before, this uses a different distributor. They look the same, but they are physically different because the advance curves are different. So they're using different internal components. If we look up front, you'll see the crankshaft is definitely different because now we have the ability to mount the twin pulley drive for the supercharger. We also have the mount here for the tensioning the belts on the supercharger. So those are different from the non-supercharged engine. On the opposite side, our manifolds are going to be completely different. But in order to show you that, we're going to actually now show you a supercharged engine that's put together. Here we have a supercharged engine, obviously assembled in a car we're working on. You can see the intake manifolds on top. The exhaust manifolds are below. They are split on supercharged Ram engines. There is a large air horn down below shielding the air that's coming to the fuel pump from the twin exhaust. The air horn goes all the way to the front of the engine there, and that allows, as I said, air to come down and cool the fuel pump. So that's quite different from the non-supercharged engine. As you notice, the carburetor is on top of the supercharger on the opposite side of the engine. So if it was normally aspirated, we'd be looking right at the carburetor on the passenger side. In the supercharged engines, the carburetors are located on the driver's side, on top of the supercharger, with a supercharger crossover tube, bringing your intake to the passenger side of the engine. As we come around to the driver's side...
Hold on. Okay, just go ahead and start over.
As we come around to the driver's side, we can see the supercharger mounted on the engine, complete with the oil filter coming off the supercharger. We can also see down here the supercharger drive, and we can see the oil center directly behind the supercharger drive. And of course, when you're dealing with a supercharged engine, you have a different version of the generator than you would on the unsupercharged cars. So that gives you a little idea of the complete difference between the various engines. As you note, the engine here is gray, Gray is the general color for most of these engines that Graham put out, until probably the last year and a half, when some of them are black and some of them are kind of a ugly greenish odd gray color, almost like they dumped all the paints together. But normally the gray, and actually new Ford gray, is a pretty close match to what they were. So that gives you a little idea of what the Graham engines are like. The Continental engines, as we've said, the 226, which Continental based off of Graham's engine, shares many components. You can use the oil pumps between them. You can use the camshafts and get away with it. You can use bearings. You can use rods. You can use pistons as long as you bore the Graham engine out. You can use most of the gasket set. But you cannot supercharge the 226 like the Graham engine was. They have different crankshafts in them, so you can't interchange those. And Graham used, believe it or not, stronger studs on top of the engine than were subsequently used by Continental. And Graham supercharged engines normally had a aluminum cylinder head that Continental never had on their engine, allowing a higher compression ratio, because at the time the supercharger is not like modern engines who use a lower compression ratio. They were able to use a higher compression ratio with the aluminum head. So that makes it different also. That gives you a little bit of idea of what to look at when you're thinking about the engines, and where to look up and find out for a fact that the Graham 217.8 is in fact a Graham designed engine. It was cast by Continental under contract, and Continental made a copy pretty much of the engine as the 226. And so parts that interchange are easy to get, but not everything interchanges. Hope that gives you some information that can be of some use.